Hello, YouTube. I hope you all can hear me just fine. I'm trying to live stream here for the first time, and I'm trying to use the new NVIDIA broadcast software, which allows me to put this, nice background here. And my background is quite intentional. It's quite related to the topic that I'm going to talk about today, which is the Western historical critical method. What is the Western historical critical method? Or more broadly, what is history? Why is it important? Why do we need to know it? Why do we need to know the theory of history? And so, a professor that I had at the University of Chicago, his name was Fred Donner, and his historiography in his book, Muhammad and the Believers, it kind of gives us an idea of how the Western historical critical method is still being used today. He's completely operating in these Enlightenment notions here. And so I'm going to call it HCM for short, historical critical method. HCM has its genealogical roots going back to the Cartesian cogito, which we mentioned in the last video of the series, What is Orientalism, or just Orientalism series. So the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, is a concept which used self-evident axioms via deductive reasoning and mathematics. This in turn left no room for the tangible of smells, sounds, colors, etc. The cogito was impervious to such tangibles that the historian dealt with regularly. And following in Aristotle's footsteps, Descartes expelled history from the hall of philosophy, the place of proper truth and truth seeking, end quote. Thereby deeming history as unscientific. And so that quote was from Breisach in his book on historiography, which I mentioned in my other video, How to Study Islamic History. Many historians went their accustomed ways, unaware of the Cartesian critique. But it was the Italian humanists who began to develop a rigorous critical and scientific approach to historiography, which included a critical, read here, skeptical, approach towards texts and undocumented traditions, with a highlight on primary sources, textual sources. This trend started in the 15th century, most notably with Giovanni Annio da Viterbo. Don't speak Italian, so if that's wrong, I'm sorry. Who may be called the father of modern philology. Viterbo was a purger of Cicero's works from post-classical medieval Latin, which he thought surely were inaccurate interpolations that must have gone against the ethos of the original historical works. The 16th century saw the Protestant theologians Philip Melanchthon and his son-in-law Caspar Poyser make the separation between sacred history, Heilsorde, and secular history, Erhaltungsorde. So this distinction between religious and secular is something that started with the Enlightenment period or the late Renaissance. It did not exist before that. Leopold von Ranke, who died in 1886, continued the humanist historiography, further developing it into Historismus, or Historyism, if you want to translate it literally from the German. And he was lauded by the American Historical Association as the father of historical science. So Leopold von Ranke, he's usually credited with being the father of the historical critical method. And he was famous for his unique use of the cogito by considering world history to be synonymous with that of Western Europe, but that India and China have, at best, a natural history. However, the Cartesian critique of history as a pseudoscience re-emerged, especially with the work of Karl Lamprecht, where the demand on Historismus was that it must include the scientific social sciences for history to be considered empirical. Sorry, my printer's goofing off over here a little bit. Despite this shift in historiography, the humanist assumptions that history ought to be a scientific professional discipline remained, and that history must be a critical science. Hence, this whole genealogy up until today is what became known as the historical critical method. When it comes to Orientalism in particular as a peripheral domain of modernity, the textual criticism problem is a mere exertion of modernity's domination over the East and over Islam, and that the indigenous Muslim version of Hadith criticism is wrong, and that Orientalists have awakened it from its millennial slumber and are progressing it gradually forward. Rather than taking the entire Hadith corpus at face value, rather than taking the entire Hadith corpus at face value as theologically motivated, Muslims they actually do not, Renka posited, history is about looking behind the textual sources to find out what really happened. Okay? A lot of Orientalism revolves around this idea. We look behind the historical text to figure out what really happened. And what is the accusation of theologically motivated, except that it's a mere slanderous, unsubstantiated, malicious libel? That's often the accusation thrown at Islamic historiography, that it's theologically motivated, it's not secular, therefore it's useless to the historian in one sense. And not only is that, I would claim, a false assumption in some ways, but it's a colonizing argumentum ad hominem. It's just an attack on the messenger, the people who transmitted Hadith, the people who recorded Islamic history, that were Muslim believers, without actually attacking critically their historiographical methods. You're not critiquing the way that they do history. You're just pushing it aside and just labeling it as theologically motivated or uncritical without taking the epistemology seriously. And it is rather an incredible assumption to associate objective reality with secularism while at the same time not substantiating one's own epistemology. In the accusation that a post-colonial subject is theologically motivated, the accusing Orientalist has in reality already lost the debate and all intellectual credibility. Oral histories of indigenous peoples are not even worthy of being engaged at face value by the accusing Orientalist because of the other's irrationality and Kantian immaturity. The Western historical critical method easily dismisses texts' authenticity via alleged anachronisms or stylistic inconsistencies rather than engaging with indigenous oral transmission or the written records claiming the text's authenticity. Miracles were seen by the historical critical method as irrational and unscientific despite their mass transmission in pre-modern societies. In their Cartesian hubris, they assume, via the principle of analogy, that all human societies always function in essentially the same way. Any contemporary anthropologist would even tell you that this is certainly not the case. However, this historiographical notion still permeates the Euro-American academe. Another characteristic of the historical critical method was later introduced by Max Weber, who died in 1920, the father of sociology, modern sociology, who argued that the eponymous founders of religion were not actually the source of the religion's teachings, but rather texts and ideas were retrogressively superimposed on past mythological figures, which is the driving idea behind the Orientalist imaginings of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the main impetus of many of their books. The composition of texts were thought to be always doubtable in their integrity because human nature was always questionable, a vestige of original sin from Christianity. So much for secular, objective unbiasedness, thus making these texts inadvertently or unintentionally corrupted by profane worldly interests such as politics, racism, bigotry, seeking prestige and or money, and so on. No engagement with indigenous epistemologies of human nature were needed from the irrational, immature other. So many Orientalists' revisionist approach to scholarship is nothing but a continuation of the historical critical method taken to an extreme. Even Ignaz Goldziher, who was an adamant anti-colonialist activist and detached from colonial powers, he was Hungarian, still could not completely break free from the paragon of Western modernity. Goldziher did not detach himself from modern epistemologies such as the historical critical method, and therefore still voraciously questioned the veracity of the Hadith corpus in his second volume of Mohammedanische Studien. There he uses the theory known as the principle of dissimilarity from Jacob Peretzonius, dated 1715, in which reports that contradict orthodoxy, as the Orientalist gets to define it, is probably originally true, since a true Orthodox Muslim would not have made it up. Ironically, according to Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, even if we take the Orientalist claim that a hadith is fabricated, often apocryphal anecdotes about famous people characterize more accurately the core of their personality than would the enumeration of their real qualities. What Jacques Lacan puts as truth has the structure of a fiction, end quote. That is to say, such fabrications are a Freudian Bejahung, affirmation, endorsing a fact contrary to deeply held convictions in a sublimated form, as something not necessarily taken literally, but perhaps metaphorically, as a deeper or higher truth. That is, even if a certain hadith may not be true according to the Orientalist, it should be. In other words, it is to capture the prophetic ethos, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Simply put, no matter one's good intentions and affinity for Islam or Muslims, one must subvert modernity by engaging with indigenous epistemologies on an equal playing field without the drive to represent and speak for the other to fellow modernists. This, my dear reader, is epistemological genocide and the whitewashing of the world at large. One case in point is that Talal Asad brings to the foray is that modernity's harsh criticism of Saudi clerics and the Saudi state. Often the Saudi clerics are pigeonholed into rejecting anything new to maintain the status quo of tradition because they do not do reasoned criticism, but rather irrational rejection of anything modern. But Assad demonstrates that not only is this completely opposite of the truth, that in fact Saudi clerics are using reasoning just as vigorous as Kant's, But even that Saudi clerics, via the notion of sincere advice, musliha, actually have more power to speak out and criticize the state than Kant could have ever dreamed of in his lifetime. And all this is coming from his book, Genealogies of Religion, Talal Asad's book. So therefore, Asad beseeches us to consider each tradition in its own terms, rather than give moral judgments from the perspective of modernity. They should learn to treat some of their own Enlightenment assumptions as belonging to specific kinds of provincialized reasoning, albeit kinds of reasoning that have largely shaped our modern world, and not as the ground from which all understanding of non-Enlightenment traditions must begin. It is quite another thing for the anthropologist to approach the native with the possibility of learning something important for her own form of life that may help to transform how that life is understood. End quote. The historical critical method and the indigenous Islamic textual criticism or historiography both have their historical genealogies and can be historicized and provincialized. Both need to converse as peers on equal terms, not just say, I'm going to just outright dismiss Islamic textual criticism, Islamic epistemologies, Islamic historiography, and so on. Likewise, we must not continue the unethical individualistic practice of research that in their indigenous people's view often rewarded researchers for telling half-truths or downright lies that misrepresented our world and that gave authority about us to academic researchers. The biggest accusation often thrown at the Orientalist is the fact that the Orientalist does not know the lived experience of what it means to be Muslim and live Islam. The Orientalist does not know what it means to fast Ramadan and to seclude oneself in the mosque for the last 10 days of Ramadan. The Orientalist does not know what it's like to pray 5 times a day. The Orientalist is, if at all truly, he's just merely acquainted with the intellectual knowledge of Islam and not the experiential knowledge of Islam. He's not a mutadawwaq, in other words, to use indigenous terminology. He doesn't have the dhawq, the taste of Islam. So what historiographical method may subvert modernity and operate in a non-oppressive way to non-Enlightenment epistemologies? And so the next video, that's basically what I'm going to get into. I talked about just kind of briefly here, gave you a brief introduction as to what the historical critical method is. And the next video, I want to talk about what historical methods can Islamic historians use nowadays in order to kind of subvert Western modernity, subvert Orientalism, and also critically develop our own epistemology. And I want to borrow some tools from modernity subsumed under an Islamic epistemology and try to come up with something that will give us a very good historical method. And it's just my proposal, my opinion, which, you know, you can agree with or disagree with. But that's what the next video is going to be about. If this streaming thing worked out here, I'll probably do it again. Be sure to like the video, subscribe, you know, click the bell. I think it's at the top of the screen to get notifications whenever I publish a video. Check out my Facebook page, Hamza the Historian. I'm also on Twitter. And check out my Patreon account. I do hope that you know, you guys can send me something there on Patreon so I can keep doing more of this work and be able to do it better for you guys and more often. But that'll be the conclusion of this video. I hope you find this beneficial, this series here on Orientalism. Please comment, you know, below or put in the live chat, which should be over here, what your ideas or opinions are, if you find this beneficial or not, what type of videos you'd like me to do in the future, and that type of thing. I always like to hear from you guys. Don't be afraid to send me an email. My email address is in the About section of my YouTube channel here. You can also send me a message on the Facebook page there. And I guess that's pretty much it. Ma salama.